It was late summer in the rugged foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, and the air was thick with humidity. The dense forest stretched for miles, an endless sea of green and shadows. The woods, though beautiful, could be unforgiving to those who were not prepared. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows as Sarah Pierce knelt in the dirt, her hands calloused and weathered from years of tending to her garden. At 68, the garden had become her sanctuary, a place where time slowed and the world felt a little more manageable. But as the years passed, the tasks that once brought her joy had become more difficult. "Just a little longer," she muttered to herself, wiping the sweat from her brow. Her garden needed tending, but her back ached with every movement. She glanced over to the row of tomatoes and smiled weakly, proud of how they had grown despite her tiredness. The timer from inside the house began to beep, reminding her of the roast she had left in the oven. She pushed herself up, grunting from the effort, her knees protesting as she made her way to the porch. With each step, the creaky boards seemed to groan under her weight, but she pressed on, determined to finish what she had started. She had been putting off this work for weeks, but now that her son, Owen, was busy with his work in town, she felt a sense of urgency. "Just a few more," she whispered again, but her thoughts were interrupted as something caught her eye on the porch. She paused, squinting into the evening light. At first she thought it might be a deer or a stray dog, but as she stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. There, lying on the porch, was a dog. Sarah stopped in her tracks, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. It wasn't just any dog. It was Mac, her son's German shepherd, the dog she had raised with Owen. Even in the poor light and disheveled state the dog was in, she recognized him instantly. His fur was matted and caked with dirt, his ribs visible beneath his thin coat, and his leg wrapped in a crude bandage. But those eyes, the familiar brown eyes that had always shown such loyalty to Owen, were unmistakable. "Good God," Sarah whispered, her heart racing as she took a cautious step forward. Her knees buckled as she tried to reach out to the dog, her legs giving way beneath her. The sight of him, so battered and broken, was a shock to her system. Mac had been missing for 2 years, just like Owen and his wife, Emily. They had vanished during a weekend camping trip, and no one had seen or heard from them since. No trace, no sign, not even a clue as to where they had gone. How is this possible?" Sarah choked out, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. The weight of what she was seeing pressed down on her chest. She dialed 911, nearly dropping the phone twice in her panic. "911, what's your emergency?" "This is Sarah Pierce," she managed to say, her voice shaking. "I need help right now. My son's dog, Mac, he's here on my porch. He's been missing for 2 years, and he's hurt." "Ma'am, can you repeat that?" "Your son's dog." "Yes," Sarah said, her voice more urgent now. "Mac, the dog that went missing with my son Owen and his wife, Emily. He's here hurt badly. I need someone to come to my house right away. We're sending units to your location, ma'am. Stay on the line, please." Sarah's legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the porch steps, unable to tear her eyes away from the dog. Mac's tail gave a weak thump, his eyes flickering with recognition as he gazed up at her. She wanted to go to him, to hold him, but her legs wouldn't obey. All she could do was whisper over and over, "Where are you, Owen? Where are you, my boy?" Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, and 2 patrol cars pulled into her driveway. Sarah's heart raced as the officers approached, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't answer. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Officer Thomas, a familiar face from the initial search for Owen, asked as he approached cautiously. "I'm fine," Sarah said, but her voice trembled. "It's Mac. He's here. My son's dog. He's been missing for 2 years." "Jesus," Officer Thomas murmured as he looked down at the dog. "Is that really him?" "It's Mac," Sarah confirmed, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. "We need to get him medical attention now," Officer Thomas said, signaling to his partner. "Let's get you inside, ma'am. We'll handle the dog." Another officer was already radioing for additional units and a veterinarian as Mac whimpered softly, barely able to move. Sarah, still in shock, was led to the back of a patrol car as the officers loaded Mac onto an animal stretcher. Her mind was racing, trying to process the impossible sight in front of her. How had Mac survived 2 years alone in the wilderness? And why was he back now after all this time? As Sarah sat in the patrol car, staring blankly out of the window, the familiar silhouette of the police station came into view. It was a surreal feeling. This place that had once been a part of her life now felt so foreign and strange. She was escorted into an interview room, where she was told detectives would need to speak with her about the situation. "I need to know what happened to my son," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah sat in the small, dimly lit interview room, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of the chair. Officer Thomas had driven her here, and now she was surrounded by detectives and officers who had been part of the search for her son, Owen, all those months ago. The room felt stifling, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Detective Riley walked in, his face tight with concern, his eyes focused on Sarah with a gentle sympathy. He was in his mid-40s, a seasoned investigator who had worked countless missing persons cases. But Sarah knew this one would be different. This one was personal. "Mrs. Pierce," he said softly, pulling up a chair across from her. "I know this is difficult, but we need you to tell us everything you can. Any detail you remember from the time before Owen and Emily left on their trip could be important." Sarah nodded slowly, trying to steady her breathing. She felt as if the room was closing in on her. Her mind kept drifting back to the moment she found Mac on the porch, the dog she hadn't seen in so long. And now, the officers were asking questions, but all she could think about was her son, her missing boy. Before they left, "Owen was excited," Sarah said, her voice tight with emotion. "He and Emily had been planning this trip for months. They wanted to get away, spend some time in the mountains, maybe do a little hiking, maybe do some hunting. Owen had always loved the outdoors. I never thought anything would happen to them. I never thought." Her voice faltered, and she wiped away a tear that had escaped her eye. Detective Riley leaned forward, nodding with understanding. Had Owen mentioned anything unusual in the days before he and Emily left? Any concerns about his work or things that might have seemed out of the ordinary? Sarah shook her head slowly.
"No."
He was excited about the trip. He said it would be a great chance to clear his head. They'd been so busy lately. Owen had been working long hours, and Emily had been planning their anniversary celebration. Everything seemed fine. The door to the room opened, and Dr. Langley, the veterinarian, stepped inside, her expression somber. "Mrs. Pierce, I wanted to update you on Mac's condition." Sarah looked up, her heart thudding in her chest. "How is he?" "He's stable," Dr. Langley replied, her voice gentle. "Severe dehydration, malnutrition, and a few infections. But we've started treatment, and we expect him to recover with time." Sarah sighed with relief, though her mind was still clouded with worry. Thank God. But where's Owen? What happened to him and Emily? Dr. Langley glanced at Detective Riley, who nodded to her before turning back to Sarah. "We're doing everything we can to find out what happened, Mrs. Pierce. The search teams have been out in the mountains, looking for any trace of your son or his wife. But, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "But so far, there's been no sign of them," Detective Riley said softly. "No bodies, no camps, nothing that suggests they were in any kind of distress. And we found something that doesn't quite add up." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "Some of Mac's tracks," Riley said, "lead into the deeper parts of the forest. But the trail is old, at least a few weeks old, maybe more. The dog was definitely surviving out there, alone, for much longer than anyone expected. Someone helped him," Sarah said, her voice firm. "That bandage on his leg wasn't something he could have done himself. Someone helped him." "Yes, that's what we're trying to figure out," Detective Riley agreed. "It's possible that someone came across Mac and took care of him, but it's also possible that he found his way back on his own. though that doesn't explain how he survived for 2 years without any signs of human contact. Sarah shook her head, unable to process it all. I don't understand. If Max survived, why wouldn't Owen and Emily have made it out? They knew the forest. They were prepared for something like this. We're not ruling anything out, Mrs. Pierce, Dr. Langley said softly. But the evidence we have so far suggests that Mac managed to adapt and survive in ways humans can't. The forest is vast, and while it's clear Mac was trying to find his way home, we can't be sure what happened to your son and his wife. There's still a chance they're out there. A sudden knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Officer Thomas stepped inside, his expression tense. Detective, Mrs. Pierce, there's something you need to see. It's urgent. Detective Riley stood up immediately, his face hardening as he exchanged a quick glance with Officer Thomas. What is it, Thomas? We've found something, Officer Thomas said, his voice low and urgent. It's on the outskirts of the search area, near the ridge where we lost Mac's trail. We need to take Mrs. Pierce there immediately. Sarah's heart raced. What have you found? Is it Owen? Emily? We don't know yet, Thomas replied, his expression tight. But we think it's worth investigating. Before Sarah could respond, Detective Riley motioned for her to follow. We'll get you there as quickly as we can, Mrs. Pierce. Let's go. Sarah, still in a daze, stumbled to her feet, her body aching from the stress of the day. Officer Thomas led the way, with Detective Riley by her side as they quickly exited the police station. The cool evening air was a stark contrast to the stifling tension in the room, but it did nothing to calm Sarah's nerves. She could feel the weight of the unknown pressing on her chest with each passing minute. They piled into a squad car, and within minutes, they were speeding through the winding roads that led toward the dense woods where Owen and Emily had disappeared. The trees loomed like dark sentinels on either side of the road, their shadows stretching long across the ground. Sarah stared out the window, hoping, praying, that this would be the break she had been waiting for, that somehow, against all odds, Owen and Emily would be found. As they drove deeper into the forest, the roads became less and less paved, and the trees seemed to grow even more oppressive. The car bounced over ruts and uneven ground, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was focused entirely on what they might find. Finally, they arrived at the edge of a small clearing where a group of officers and search dogs were gathered. Sarah's heart sank as she saw them. 2 paramedics were crouched near something on the ground, speaking in hushed tones. Over here, Mrs. Pierce, Detective Riley said gently, guiding her toward the group. He kept his voice low, careful not to let the tension break through. Take a look. Sarah's legs felt weak beneath her as she approached the scene. As she drew closer, she saw what the paramedics had uncovered. It wasn't a body, thank God, but it was something almost as disturbing. A tent, barely recognizable, had been half buried under a blanket of fallen branches and leaves. The edges of the tent were torn and weathered, as if it had been there for much longer than anyone could have imagined. Nearby, a broken compass lay discarded in the dirt, its needle spinning wildly. But it wasn't the tent that made Sarah's stomach churn. It was the faint, fresh trail of blood leading away from the camp. I don't understand, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. What is this? Was this their camp? It's possible, Detective Riley replied, crouching beside her. But the blood trail leads into a deeper part of the woods. We think someone or something may have dragged whoever was here further in. We need to follow it. The officers began to prepare their equipment, their faces grim as they readied themselves for what might be a difficult search. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Was this the breakthrough they had been waiting for, or was it another dead end? We're going to get answers, Mrs. Pierce, Detective Riley said, his tone resolute. I promise you that. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The blood trail was faint, as though it had been there for much longer than anyone had realized. It wasn't the kind of trail left by someone in immediate danger. It felt old, like the person had been dragged away over time, their blood slowly seeping into the earth. Her mind raced with questions. Who had been here? Had it been Owen? Had it been Emily? And if they had been here, where were they now? The dense forest closed in around them, the trees pressing so tightly together that it felt like they were walking through a tunnel. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the underbrush and the distant calls of wildlife. Sarah was so focused on the trail ahead that she barely noticed the sound of footsteps behind her until they were nearly upon her. She turned to see Officer Thomas, his face drawn, his eyes filled with concern. "Detective Riley," he called, his voice tense. "You need to see this." They hurried over to where Thomas stood, and Sarah's heart sank once more. There, just off the trail, was a clearing, and in the center of it something that made her blood run cold. A small pile of clothing, torn and weathered by time, was scattered across the forest floor. It looked like it had been abandoned, but there was no sign of the person who had once worn it. The clothes were stained with dirt, blood, and what appeared to be dried mud. But it wasn't just the clothes that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It was the faintest trace of blood near the edges of the clearing, leading into the dense trees. "I don't like this," Detective Riley said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "This doesn't look like an accident. Someone was here, and they didn't leave willingly." "Where's Owen?" Sarah gasped, her heart pounding. "Where is he?" Riley's face tightened with resolve. "We're going to find him, Mrs. Pierce. We won't stop until we do." But deep down, Sarah couldn't help but wonder. Was this going to be the end of the search? Had they finally found a clue? Or were they walking into another trap set by the forest itself? The search intensified as the hours dragged on. The clearing where they found the discarded clothes was quickly cordoned off, and a team of investigators began combing through the area. But despite their best efforts, the trail seemed to vanish into thin air. There were no more signs of struggle, no more clues to lead them toward Owen or Emily. It was as if they had simply disappeared, leaving nothing behind but the remnants of a camp long forgotten. Sarah felt a heavy weight in her chest as she stood in the clearing, watching the officers move through the woods with their flashlights, their voices low but urgent. Every time one of them called out, her heart skipped a beat, but it was always the same: nothing. "Why isn't anyone talking to me?" Sarah whispered to herself. She had been silent for too long, standing back as the professionals did their job. But every moment that passed felt like an eternity. Every step deeper into the forest only made her fear grow. What if they were too late? What if her son had been lost forever? Detective Riley walked up beside her. His eyes darkened with exhaustion but still filled with determination. "We've called in additional units. We're not giving up. We just need to be thorough. It's a large area, and we can't leave any stone unturned." "How long do you think this is going to take?" Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. The weight of the search, the unknowns, and the fear for Owen's safety had her on the edge of breaking down. She needed answers, any answers. "We'll keep searching until we've covered every inch of this place," Riley said. "But I understand how you feel. We're doing everything we can." Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe they were close to finding Owen and Emily. But deep down, the silence in the woods felt suffocating. It felt like a warning, an ominous sign that they were running out of time. She stepped away from the group, her eyes scanning the trees, the shadows creeping in as dusk settled over the land. It was then that she noticed something, a glint of metal, half hidden in the underbrush. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, crouching down to get a better look. It was a piece of broken gear, a compass that had clearly been used often. Sarah's heart raced. This wasn't a coincidence. It had to be a sign. "Detective!" she called, her voice urgent as she waved Riley over. He jogged toward her, his face tight with focus. "I found something," Sarah said, pointing to the glinting object on the ground. Riley kneeled beside her, his hand carefully brushing away the dirt and leaves to reveal the compass more clearly. He studied it for a moment before looking up at Sarah. "It's one of Owen's," he said, his voice grave. "I recognize it. This was part of his survival kit. He always carried it on him when he went into the mountains." Sarah's pulse quickened. "So they were here. They were definitely here, Riley." Riley's face grew even more somber. This is the first clear evidence we found in days that points to Owen. It confirms he was in this area, but it doesn't tell us where he went or what happened next. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to hold back the surge of hope that was threatening to overwhelm her. She had spent 2 years in agony, wondering if she would ever see her son again. To find this piece of evidence felt like a breakthrough, one small step closer to the truth. "We need to find more," Riley said, standing up. "This is a start, but we need to follow the trail. We're going to keep searching." Just as Sarah was about to ask where they would go next, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. It was Officer Thomas, his face tight with exhaustion and frustration. "Detective Riley," he said, his voice laced with tension, "there's something else you need to see. We found another campsite, off the main trail, deep in the woods." "Is it Owen's?" Riley asked immediately, his voice filled with urgency. "We don't know yet," Thomas replied, his gaze flicking to Sarah. "But there are signs of a struggle. We're not sure who it was, but someone has been hiding out there." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. A campsite? A struggle? This could be it, the breakthrough she had been waiting for. "Let's go," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with determination. She didn't care how long it took, how dangerous it might be. She had to find Owen. She had to know what had happened to him. Riley nodded, signaling to the rest of the team. "Everyone, get ready to move out. We've got another lead. Let's make sure we're thorough. No one gets left behind." Sarah followed the officers through the dense forest, the sound of her breath quickening as they moved deeper into the woods. The trees grew even thicker here, the underbrush more difficult to navigate. But she didn't care. She couldn't stop now. As they reached the new campsite, Sarah's pulse raced. There, in the clearing, was a small fire pit surrounded by rocks, the ashes still warm. It looked like it had been used recently. She crouched down, inspecting the ground. There were fresh footprints leading away from the camp, heading further into the wilderness. "Whoever was here wasn't alone," Riley said quietly, his eyes scanning the area. "There are 2 sets of tracks. One is fresh, maybe a day or 2 old. The other is older, maybe a week or more." "Do you think Owen and Emily could have been here?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with emotion. Riley nodded, his face serious. "It's possible, but we need to keep following the trail." Sarah followed closely, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. With each step, she could almost hear Owen's voice in her mind, urging her to keep going. They moved silently through the woods, following the footprints deeper into the forest. But as they did, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Something in the air had changed. The woods, which had once felt like a place of solace for her family, now felt like a trap. The forest grew even more oppressive as they moved deeper into the woods. The air was thick, the humidity almost suffocating. Every step Sarah took felt heavier, like the earth itself was trying to swallow her whole. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to something, or someone. But the uncertainty gnawed at her. What were they walking into? Were they about to find Owen and Emily, or had they stumbled upon something far more sinister? They followed the tracks for what felt like hours, the only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. The further they went, the quieter the woods seemed to become. The usual rustling of animals, the chirping of birds, had all but disappeared. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Finally, they reached the edge of a small ravine, the ground steep and rocky. The footprints led right to the edge, where they seemed to disappear. Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach as she stared down into the darkness below. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened to the person who had left those tracks. "Where did they go?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with frustration. "What happened here?" Riley crouched down at the edge of the ravine, his eyes scanning the area carefully. Whoever it was might have climbed down. It's possible they set up camp down there. "We need to go down there," Sarah said, her voice urgent. She couldn't stand the thought of another dead end. She had to keep searching. Her heart ached with the need for answers. Riley hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the group of officers. "It's risky," he said, his voice low. "The terrain is dangerous, and it's getting dark. We might not be able to find our way back up." "I don't care," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "I'm going down there. You don't have to follow, but I will." Riley met her gaze, and for a moment, she saw something in his eyes. Concern, yes, but also a quiet respect. "We'll follow," he said finally. "But we need to be careful. One wrong step and we could be in trouble." With that, they carefully made their way down the ravine. The ground was loose, the rocks slippery from the recent rain, but Sarah pushed forward, determined. The air grew colder as they descended, the shadows lengthening in the fading light. The only sounds now were the rustling of their feet in the dirt and the occasional distant sound of an animal moving in the underbrush. When they finally reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small, hidden valley. It was isolated, the trees towering above them, blocking most of the remaining light. The ground here was soft, covered in moss and ferns. In the center of the clearing, a makeshift camp had been set up, just like the one they had found earlier. There was a fire pit, now cold and dark, and a few scattered belongings. But it was the signs around the camp that made Sarah's blood run cold. Footprints, fresh and deep, led away from the camp toward a small cave entrance on the far side of the valley. The trail was unmistakable. 2 sets of prints, both still visible in the dirt, heading into the darkness. "They were here," Sarah breathed, her eyes locked on the tracks. "Owen and Emily were here." Riley crouched next to her, his expression grim. "We don't know that for sure, Mrs. Pierce. The tracks could belong to anyone, but we'll follow them." Sarah clenched her fists at her sides, fighting the urge to rush forward. She had been waiting for this moment for so long, the hope that her son and daughter-in-law were alive, and now that it was finally within reach, she could feel the fear rising in her chest. As they moved toward the cave, the air grew even colder. The darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides. The sounds of the forest had completely stopped, and the only thing left was the sound of their breathing, shallow and fast. They reached the cave entrance, and Riley paused, glancing back at the group. "Stay alert," he murmured. "We don't know what's inside." Sarah stepped forward, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't stop now. She had to know what happened to Owen, and she was willing to risk everything to find out. The group slowly made their way inside, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The cave was narrow at first, but it soon opened up into a larger space. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. "Do you smell that?" Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. Riley nodded. "It smells like blood." Sarah's stomach turned, and she had to fight the rising bile in her throat. Was Owen here? Had he been hurt? She pushed the thought aside and forced herself to keep moving. They reached the far end of the cave, and there, sprawled across the floor, was something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was a body. The body lay in the shadows, partially obscured by the rocks and dirt, but there was no mistaking it. A person, possibly in their early 30s, clothed in tattered, blood-stained clothes. The faint outline of the face was visible, though it was bruised and battered beyond recognition. The stench of decay clung to the air, making Sarah's throat tighten with revulsion. But despite the horror of the scene, one thing was clear. It wasn't Owen. Sarah's heart dropped. She'd been so sure. The tracks had led them here, and she had hoped, beyond hope, that this was where they would find him. But the man before her wasn't her son. The clothes, the face, nothing matched. Who is it?" Sarah whispered, unable to tear her eyes away from the lifeless figure. Detective Riley bent down, careful not to disturb the scene. "We don't know yet," he said softly. "We'll need to get a positive ID. But I'm afraid this could be another victim of whoever has been operating in these woods." A sinking feeling filled Sarah's chest, a gnawing dread she couldn't shake. Her arm tightened. "We can't let them find us. We have to go deeper into the forest. There's an old trail up ahead. If we can get to it, we can lose them." Sarah nodded, too scared to speak. Her mind was spinning, the fear of being caught paralyzing. They couldn't let Thomas and his accomplices catch up to them, not when they were so close to discovering the truth. The footsteps grew louder. Riley turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with resolve. "On three, we run for the trail. No hesitation." She nodded, barely able to breathe. 1, 2, 3. They dashed from their hiding spot, racing through the trees, their feet pounding against the dirt. Sarah didn't look back. She could hear the sound of footsteps and voices behind them, but she forced herself to keep moving, focused only on the path ahead. The trail was closer now, the familiar shape of the old path winding through the trees, offering a potential escape route. Riley's pace was quickening, but Sarah was starting to feel the burn in her legs, her breath coming in desperate gasps. She couldn't stop, though. She couldn't let them catch up to her now. Suddenly, there was a loud thud behind her, followed by a cry of pain. Riley faltered for a moment, his eyes flicking back. "They're shooting!" Sarah screamed, panic rising in her chest. Without thinking, she surged forward, pushing herself faster, refusing to be caught. But as they neared the trail, she felt the sharp sting of something grazing her shoulder. A bullet. Her body jolted with the impact, but she didn't stop. Riley reached out for her, his hand gripping her arm, pulling her toward the safety of the narrow path ahead. "Keep going," Riley shouted. They finally reached the trail, stumbling into the thick brush beyond. Sarah felt the blood trickling down her shoulder, but there was no time to stop, no time to assess the pain. They were not safe yet. They had to get further away. As the sounds of pursuit continued to echo behind them, Sarah's mind was consumed with one thought. They weren't going to let her go. Not until they made sure she never found the truth. The trail ahead was narrow, barely wide enough for them to move in single file. Sarah's legs were burning with exhaustion, her breath ragged from the frantic sprint. She could feel the blood seeping from the wound on her shoulder, but there was no time to stop, no time to think. The only thing that mattered now was putting as much distance between themselves and the men chasing them as possible. Behind her, she could hear Riley's heavy breathing, his footsteps steady but urgent. "We can't stop now," he murmured between breaths. "We're almost there. Just keep moving." Sarah nodded, trying to force her legs to obey, her mind spinning with every step. The pain in her shoulder was sharp, but it was a distant throb compared to the overwhelming fear that gripped her heart. They couldn't afford to get caught. They couldn't afford to fail. The trail twisted ahead, a thin ribbon of dirt and rock that snaked through the thick underbrush. The trees were dense on either side, blocking the fading light of the evening. The only sound now was the steady rush of their footsteps, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Sarah could feel the forest closing in around them, the oppressive weight of the darkness making her feel more and more trapped. Suddenly, Riley's hand shot out, grabbing her arm and pulling her to a halt. "Quiet," he whispered urgently, his voice barely audible. He crouched low, signaling for Sarah to do the same. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sank into a crouch beside him, her breath shallow. She listened intently, but at first, all she could hear was the rustling of the trees. Then, a low murmur broke the silence, voices. "Close. They're getting closer," Riley whispered, his voice tight with tension. "We need to move off the trail. Now." Before Sarah could react, Riley tugged her away from the path, guiding her toward the thicker underbrush. They moved swiftly, staying low to the ground, their feet brushing against the soft earth as they maneuvered deeper into the forest. The voices grew louder, the sound of approaching footsteps unmistakable. "Where are they?" a voice hissed. It was Thomas's voice, now filled with frustration. "They can't be far. Keep looking," another man responded, his voice gruff. "They won't get away. Not after everything we've invested." Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. Everything they've invested. She didn't know what that meant, but it didn't sound good. Whatever had been happening in these woods, it was much bigger than she had imagined, and now she was at the center of it. The crackling of leaves and twigs sounded closer, and Riley motioned for them to move again. They weren't safe here, not yet. They veered off the trail, heading for a small ridge that rose up from the forest floor. Riley's eyes darted ahead, scanning the path as they moved. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and for a moment, Sarah thought she heard something else. A distant noise, almost like an engine. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her pulse quickening. Riley paused, listening. "Yeah, I hear it. There's a road nearby. We might be able to get to it and lose them in the trees." The sound of the engine grew louder, the distinct hum of a vehicle's engine cutting through the forest silence. Sarah felt a spark of hope. If they could make it to the road, they might be able to find help, or at least get a better sense of where they were. Riley led them up the ridge, each step bringing them closer to the faint sound of the engine. The forest seemed to thin out a little here, the trees more spaced apart, and they moved more swiftly. As they crested the ridge, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Below them, through the trees, she could see the faint outline of a road. A dirt path, barely visible in the gathering dusk, winding its way through the wilderness. "There," Riley murmured. "That's our shot. If we can get to the road, we can flag down the vehicle. It might be our only chance." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't care about the danger anymore. She just wanted out. She just wanted to know what had happened to Owen, what had happened to Emily, and what was lurking in the dark corners of these woods. They moved quickly, the road now within sight. Sarah's legs burned, but she pushed forward, determined. But just as they were about to reach the road, a shout rang out from behind them. "Stop!" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. They had been spotted. The figure of Thomas appeared at the edge of the ridge, his gun raised, his eyes filled with cold determination. "Run!" Riley shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the road with renewed urgency. But before they could take another step, the sound of another vehicle echoed through the trees. A truck, its headlights cutting through the night. It was coming fast. Sarah's heart sank. The truck had to be theirs, whoever was behind all of this. "Riley, we have to get to that truck," Sarah shouted, her voice strained with fear. "I know," Riley said, his voice grim, "but we can't let them trap us." They ran toward the road, but the vehicle was getting closer, its engine roaring louder as it barreled down the dirt path. Sarah could hear the tires crunching against the earth, and the realization hit her. They were running out of time. The truck rounded the corner, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the headlights before Riley pulled her to the ground behind a large boulder at the side of the road. They pressed themselves flat against the ground, barely daring to breathe as the truck screeched to a halt nearby. They were so close. But was it too late? The truck's headlights illuminated the night, casting long shadows over the road as it came to a screeching halt. Sarah held her breath, her body pressed flat against the cool ground, the gravel digging into her skin as she stayed perfectly still. Riley was beside her, just as tense, his hand gripping hers tightly. The engine of the truck sputtered, then died, and the sound of heavy boots hitting the ground reached Sarah's ears. She could hear the men approaching, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. The truck had clearly stopped just a few feet away. Every muscle in Sarah's body screamed to run, but they couldn't move. Not yet. "Where are they?" The voice of the man who had chased them echoed through the night. It was Thomas's voice again, cold and furious. "They can't have gone far." "I don't know, but we'll find them," another man replied, his voice gruff. "They can't hide forever." Sarah's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wanted to scream, to break free from the grip of fear that had a stranglehold on her. But she couldn't risk it. If they made a sound, if they moved too soon, it was over. The men would catch them. The footsteps grew louder, closer now. Sarah could see the shapes of the men, their figures silhouetted by the dim light of the truck's fading headlights. She pressed herself even lower to the ground, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. She could hear the men talking, their voices low but urgent. "We need to find them," Thomas said, his voice filled with venom. "They've seen too much. They can't leave this forest alive." Riley's grip on Sarah tightened. The words hit her like a physical blow. They were hunting them, and they wouldn't stop until they were dead. The men were right there, only a few yards away. Sarah's mind raced. She knew they had to act soon. But what could they do? The truck was blocking the path, and the men were too close for comfort. If they tried to move, they'd be caught. They had no weapons, no means of defense, and no way of getting away. "Come on," one of the men muttered. "Let's check behind the truck. They can't be far." Sarah held her breath, praying that they wouldn't look their way. Her body was trembling, her entire being filled with the fight-or-flight response. But she knew if they made a single noise, it was over. She closed her eyes for a split second, trying to steady herself, and when she opened them again, she saw Riley's eyes locked on hers. Focused, determined. He nodded slightly, silently signaling that they needed to make their move. Without a word, Riley started to shift, slowly, cautiously. Sarah followed his lead, carefully inching forward, her body flat against the ground, using the cover of the truck to stay hidden from the men. They couldn't afford to be caught. They had to make it to the woods, to the dense cover beyond. The truck was their only chance of escape. The men were still talking, moving closer to the truck. Sarah's heart thudded harder in her chest. This was it. She was just waiting for the right moment. Then, Riley whispered urgently, "On my count, we run." Sarah nodded, her body coiled like a spring. She had to trust him. They didn't have a choice. 1, 2, Riley began. Suddenly, the sound of a twig snapping underfoot cut through the night. "Did you hear that?" one of the men said, his voice sharp with suspicion. The blood drained from Sarah's face. They had been made. They hadn't been quiet enough. The men were turning toward them now, their eyes scanning the shadows for movement. "Run!" Riley barked, pulling Sarah to her feet in one swift motion. They bolted. The rush of adrenaline surged through Sarah's veins, and she could hear the men shouting behind them. But there was no time to think. She ran as fast as she could, pushing her aching body beyond its limits. Riley was just ahead, his strides long and sure. The sounds of pursuit were growing louder, but they were fast, faster than they had been before. They broke through the trees, the dense underbrush scratching at their skin as they pushed forward. Sarah's chest burned with the effort, but she refused to stop. They were getting closer to the safety of the trees. The truck was behind them now, but the men were still chasing them, their voices getting nearer with each passing second. "Keep moving," Riley shouted, glancing over his shoulder. "We can't stop yet." They reached a small ridge, the steep incline just enough to put some distance between them and the men. Sarah's legs wobbled beneath her, but she kept pushing forward, heart hammering, fear urging her to move faster. The men were close now, the sounds of their footsteps unmistakable. They were almost at the top of the ridge when Sarah heard one of them yell, "They're up ahead! Cut them off!" The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. There was nowhere left to go. They were trapped. The ridge led into an open field, a wide expanse of land with no cover. If they reached it, they would be exposed. The men would catch them. Riley's face tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he was considering something. Then, without a word, he grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her off the ridge and toward the trees. "We need to go left," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "We'll circle back around. They won't expect us to double back." Sarah barely had time to process the plan before Riley tugged her in the direction he'd indicated. They were still running faster now, toward a thicket of trees that would hopefully offer them the cover they desperately needed. The men were too close. Sarah could hear their voices clearly now, too clearly. They were gaining on them, their footsteps quick and heavy. "Come on," Riley shouted. "We have to make it to the creek. It's our only chance." Sarah pushed herself harder, but every step felt like it might be her last. The men were too close. They could hear them now, right behind them. The sounds of pursuit were louder than ever. The sounds of footsteps grew louder, the men closing in on them with terrifying speed. Sarah's heart pounded harder with every step, her legs aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had never felt more exhausted, more afraid, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Riley was just ahead of her, his face set in grim determination as he pushed through the underbrush, pulling Sarah along with him. "Almost there," Riley muttered through clenched teeth, his voice strained. "We need to reach the creek. If we can get to the water, we might lose them." Sarah's chest burned, but she forced herself to push forward, ignoring the sharp pain in her side. She had to keep going. They had no other choice. The men were too close, their voices cutting through the night air, taunting them, warning them that escape was almost impossible. "You can't run forever," one of the men shouted, his voice laced with anger. "We're coming for you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The desperation in the man's voice was chilling. It wasn't just about finding them. It was about finishing what they had started. "We're almost there," Riley shouted again, his hand tight around Sarah's wrist. "Just a little further." They were nearing the creek now. Sarah could hear the rush of water ahead, and the sound filled her with a strange sense of hope. The creek offered an escape route, a way to throw off their pursuers. If they could get in the water, the men would have a much harder time tracking them. With one final push, they broke through the last line of trees and into the open space near the creek. The water glistened in the dim light, rushing over rocks with a steady roar. Riley didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sarah's arm and led her straight into the water, the cold shock of it nearly knocking the breath out of her. The water was fast, rushing over her ankles, her knees, pulling her downstream with force. But Sarah didn't care. She kept moving, her feet stumbling on the slick rocks as she struggled to keep her balance. "Keep going," Riley urged, his voice sharp with urgency. "We need to go deeper. We can't let them track us." Sarah's legs felt like lead, but she kept going, determined to follow him, to outrun the nightmare that had followed them this far. The sounds of the men's pursuit were still behind them, but now the roar of the creek drowned out most of the voices. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to hope. They were getting away. Maybe, just maybe, they would escape. But then, a shout rang out from behind them, cutting through the sound of the rushing water. "They're in the creek," one of the men yelled. "They're heading downstream. Don't let them get away." Fear surged through Sarah again, and she pushed herself faster, the cold water rushing past her thighs, her feet slipping on the rocks beneath. She glanced back, but it was impossible to see the men through the trees. The night had swallowed them whole, and the darkness was their only cover. "Don't stop," Riley said, his voice firm, though it was filled with tension. "We can lose them. Keep going." They moved deeper into the creek, the water rising higher around them as they fought to stay on their feet. The current was swift, pulling them both further downstream, but Riley led them through it, his eyes scanning the area ahead for any sign of the men. The trees thickened again, the shadows deepening as they moved away from the creek. Riley didn't slow down. He kept pushing forward, forcing Sarah to keep up. There was no time for rest, no time to look back. They had to keep moving. Finally, after what felt like hours, Riley slowed down, his breath coming in ragged gasps as they reached a small overhang, a natural shelter in the trees. They ducked beneath it, panting for breath, the cold water still rushing around their legs. "We can rest here for a minute," Riley said, his voice strained. He looked at Sarah, his eyes flicking to her shoulder. "Are you hurt badly?" Sarah glanced down at her shoulder, noticing the bloodstains on her clothes for the first time. It had been a shallow graze, but it had bled more than she realized. The pain was sharp but manageable. "I'll be fine," she said, though her voice trembled. "We need to keep moving." Riley nodded but didn't argue. Instead, he pulled a small flashlight from his pack, shining it briefly around the area to ensure there was no immediate danger. "They'll be looking for us," Sarah said, her voice low but determined. "We can't stop here for long." "We won't," Riley replied. "But we need to take a moment. We've lost some ground, but not enough. If they have dogs or another vehicle, they'll catch up soon." Sarah nodded, taking a moment to catch her breath, though the fear was a constant companion, gnawing at her every thought. "How do we keep them from finding us?" Riley's expression was grim as he scanned the area again. "We need to make it to the old ranger station. If we can get there, we might be able to get help. The ranger station? Sarah repeated, looking at him with surprise. Isn't that deep in the woods? It is, Riley said. But it's the closest place we can get to that might have communication. If we can get there, we can alert someone. And if we don't? Sarah asked, her voice quiet. Then we keep running, Riley said firmly, meeting her gaze. We don't stop until we have answers. For the first time since they'd started running, Sarah allowed herself a small nod. She didn't know if they would make it out of this alive, but she wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when the truth was so close, and the people responsible were still out there, hunting them. Riley stood up, wiping his face with the back of his hand. We move in 5 minutes. Get ready. Sarah nodded, the weight of everything hanging heavily on her shoulders. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. There was too much at stake, and she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. The minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one heavier than the last as Sarah and Riley crouched beneath the overhang, listening intently for any signs of movement from behind them. The creek continued its relentless rush, the sound providing a kind of eerie calm in the midst of their terror. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a branch sent Sarah's heart racing, but there was no way to know if the men were still on their trail. 5 minutes, Riley whispered, glancing at Sarah. His eyes were sharp, his face etched with weariness but still determined. The brief rest had given them some reprieve, but it had also highlighted just how exposed they were. They couldn't afford another misstep. The weight of the moment pressed down on Sarah, and she gritted her teeth, trying to push the exhaustion aside. She felt the cold from her shoulder wound creep through her body, but she couldn't afford to slow down now. Every instinct screamed at her to stay alert, to stay focused. We need to get to that ranger station, Riley continued in a low murmur. Once we're there, we can figure out our next move. It's the best shot we've got. Sarah nodded without speaking, trying to steady her breathing. There was a sharp pain in her side from the run, but it was nothing compared to the fear in her chest. Fear that they would be found. Fear that they wouldn't reach the station in time. The longer they waited, the more the odds seemed to stack against them. Riley stood up first, glancing around one last time to ensure they hadn't been spotted. The darkness of the forest seemed to envelop them, and it was almost too quiet, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. We need to keep to the path, Riley said. It'll take us straight to the station. If we cut through the forest now, we might miss it. Sarah followed closely, her footsteps cautious, but determined. She could feel the weight of the silence around them, every step echoing in her mind. They moved swiftly, staying low to the ground as they navigated the dense underbrush. The forest felt vast and impersonal, like a maze that could swallow them whole at any moment. As they moved deeper into the woods, the sounds of the forest seemed to fade into the background, the air growing colder and heavier. It was as if the night was closing in on them. They couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to slow down. Every step felt like it might be their last. Do you think they'll give up? Sarah asked, her voice a faint whisper in the stillness. No, Riley replied, his tone unwavering. They won't stop. They're too close. But we have a chance to lose them if we get to the station. It's our best shot. The sound of distant voices echoed through the trees again, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. They were close, too close. She tried to ignore the fear creeping in, focusing instead on the trail ahead. If they could just make it another few miles, they might have a chance. The path ahead became steeper, the incline rising as they approached a small hill. Riley quickened his pace, pulling Sarah along with him. But just as they reached the top, the unmistakable sound of footsteps broke through the quiet. Get down, Riley whispered urgently, pulling Sarah down behind a thick tree. They crouched low, barely breathing, as the figures of 2 men emerged from the shadows below. Sarah's pulse raced as she watched them move through the trees, their eyes scanning the darkness. The light from their flashlights flickered, moving steadily in their direction. They're coming, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. Riley nodded grimly, his face a mask of concentration. They can't see us here. We wait for them to pass. The men drew closer, their flashlights sweeping across the area. Sarah held her breath, willing herself to stay still, not daring to make a sound. The moments seemed to stretch on forever as the men moved closer to their hiding spot. Sarah's body was trembling, but she fought to stay calm, her mind focused on the path ahead. "Keep quiet," Riley whispered once more, his voice tight. Sarah could hear the men's voices now, faint but clear. "They couldn't have gone far. Keep looking. We've got to find them. They're dangerous." The men passed by, their figures vanishing into the trees. Riley waited a few seconds, watching them disappear into the distance. Once the sounds of their footsteps faded, he motioned for Sarah to follow. "Let's move. Now," he said, his voice steady but urgent. They made their way up the hill, their steps careful but quick. The ridge was within reach, and Riley seemed to sense the urgency as much as Sarah did. The sooner they reached the ranger station, the better. Finally, they broke through the trees and onto a narrow path that led to the ranger station. It was just ahead, a small, dilapidated building barely visible in the shadows. The area around it was dark and quiet, but it was their best hope of getting help, or at least hiding long enough to regroup. Riley led the way, but Sarah's eyes darted around, watching for any sign of movement. They weren't safe yet. The men could be right behind them. Her heart thudded in her chest, her fear growing with each step. When they finally reached the station, Riley reached for the door, only to stop short. "It's locked," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "Can you break in?" Sarah asked, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "We need to get inside." Riley nodded, his eyes scanning the station for any sign of an entrance. "We have no choice. We'll find a way in." He moved quickly to the side of the station, looking for a window or another way to get inside. Sarah stood still, watching the trees nervously. Every second felt like a ticking clock. She felt like they were teetering on the edge of something terrible, and the sense of urgency was more real than ever. As Riley worked, Sarah heard something else. Another vehicle, distant but unmistakable. The low hum of an engine reached her ears, growing louder as it approached. "They're coming," she whispered. Riley didn't look back. He was focused on breaking into the station. But the sound of the truck, whoever was coming, made Sarah's stomach twist. Would they make it inside before they were found? The engine's hum grew louder, and Sarah could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Whoever was driving the truck was getting closer, and the unmistakable sound of tires crunching on the dirt road made her stomach churn. They couldn't afford to be found now, not when they were so close to the station. The tension in the air was suffocating. "Riley," Sarah whispered urgently, her voice tight with fear. "We have to hurry. They're almost here." Riley's face was grim as he fumbled with the old wooden window frame, trying to find a way in. His fingers worked quickly, but the anxiety in his eyes was unmistakable. They had to make it inside. The truck was too close. Too close. "I'm trying," Riley muttered through clenched teeth. "It's old, but it'll work. Just stay low." The sounds of the approaching truck grew louder, the engine rumbling through the trees. Sarah's heart raced as she watched Riley work, his movements swift and deliberate. She could hear the footsteps of the men, their voices muffled but growing closer. The time to act was slipping away. Finally, with a low, satisfying click, Riley yanked open the window. He turned to Sarah, his eyes dark with urgency. "We're in. Go," he said quickly, helping her through the window first. "Get inside, fast. I'll be right behind you." Sarah didn't hesitate. She scrambled through the window, her legs aching from the run, her shoulders still stinging with every movement. She hit the ground inside with a soft thud, her heart in her throat as she glanced back at Riley. The sounds of the men's footsteps grew louder. They were getting closer. Riley followed swiftly, his movements quick and efficient. He closed the window behind them with barely a sound, and they both crouched low in the dim light of the ranger station. The building smelled musty, stale, but it offered the cover they desperately needed. "Stay quiet," Riley whispered, his voice tense. "We wait. Let them pass." Sarah's breath was shallow as she crouched next to him. The minutes felt like hours, each one heavier than the last. She could hear the men's voices now, their words distorted by the walls of the station. "Where are they?" one of the men growled. "They can't have gone far. The tracks." "We'll find them," another voice said, his tone sharp and confident. "No one runs from us." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. They were close, too close. The men were right outside. But the ranger station had one advantage. The walls were thick, the windows small, and the trees outside provided a buffer. For now, they were hidden. But for how long? Riley held his breath, his eyes flicking to Sarah. She could see the tension in his jaw, the worry that creased his forehead. They couldn't stay here forever. The men wouldn't give up. Not after everything that had happened. "They'll search the building," Riley whispered. "They'll check every door and window. We need to keep moving." Sarah nodded, her mind working quickly. There was no way out of this place except through the front door, and even if they made it to the door, there was no guarantee they could outrun the men. They had no weapons, no backup. But they had to try. "Is there a way out?" Sarah asked, her voice strained. "A back door or something?" Riley's eyes darted around the room, his gaze searching the dark corners for any sign of an escape route. The room was small and cramped, cluttered with old maps, tools, and equipment. The dim light from the single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long shadows over the walls. "Nothing," Riley muttered. "But we can't wait here. We'll have to find another way." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of a door creaking open reached their ears. "They're inside," Riley said, his voice low. "Stay down. Don't move." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She held her breath, her eyes fixed on Riley. The sound of footsteps echoed through the small building, followed by muffled voices. "They're in here," one of the men said. "Check the back rooms." The door to the ranger station creaked open, and Sarah's stomach twisted in fear. They had to make it out or they would be trapped here for good. Riley's eyes darted around the room, then to Sarah. He made a subtle gesture, motioning for her to stay still. He grabbed a flashlight from the counter and switched it on, flicking it in the direction of the back rooms. "Keep low," he whispered. "We move in the shadows." The footsteps grew louder, the men getting closer. They were searching the building methodically, room by room, moving closer to where Sarah and Riley were hiding. The tension in the air was unbearable. Every second felt like a lifetime. Suddenly, one of the men's voices rose above the others. "They're here. They're in the back." The door to the back room slammed open, and Sarah's blood ran cold. They had been found. "Run!" Riley shouted, his voice fierce. Without thinking, Sarah bolted toward the back door, her feet pounding against the wooden floor. She reached for the door handle, and with a quick twist, she threw the door open, spilling into the night air. The forest was just ahead, the shadows of the trees stretching out before them. But they were not alone. The men were right behind them, closing in fast. "Don't stop," Riley yelled, pushing Sarah forward. They ran into the night, their feet barely touching the ground, their breaths harsh in the cold air. The men's voices were distant now, but the sound of their pursuit was relentless, just as it had been all along. Sarah's legs burned, but she couldn't stop. They were so close. They could lose them in the forest if they were fast enough. They had to keep moving. The forest swallowed them whole, the darkness closing in as they dashed between trees, their movements quick and desperate. The sounds of the men's pursuit faded behind them, but Sarah knew it wasn't over. They were still being hunted. They had to make it to safety. The night air was cold against Sarah's face, and her lungs burned with each frantic breath. She couldn't remember the last time she had run this hard, this desperately. Her legs screamed, but she pushed herself harder, faster. The sound of the men's footsteps had faded, but she knew they wouldn't stop. The chase would continue until they either ran out of ground or ran out of time. Riley was just ahead, his movements swift and sure as he led the way through the thick trees. He was still a few steps ahead, but he was always within reach, and that was enough. She had to keep up, had to trust him. The forest around them was a maze of trees and underbrush, and every step felt like they were being swallowed by the night. "Riley, where are we going?" Sarah gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart was pounding, each beat heavy with dread. "We can't keep running forever. We need to get to higher ground," Riley replied, not looking back. "There's an old lookout tower a few miles from here. It'll give us an advantage. If we can get there, we might be able to signal someone." The words barely registered. She couldn't think about how far they had to go. She could only focus on keeping up, putting one foot in front of the other. The sounds of the men pursuing them were still distant, but Sarah knew they wouldn't be able to outrun them forever. The path grew steeper as they climbed higher into the woods, the incline making their progress slow. The trees thinned out as they neared a ridge, and Sarah could see the first glimpses of moonlight breaking through the canopy above. The ground beneath their feet grew rockier, and the air felt thinner as they ascended. She glanced over her shoulder, her chest tight with fear, but there was no sign of the men. The silence in the woods was oppressive, like the calm before the storm. They hadn't stopped chasing them, not for a moment. But for now, the men were out of sight. "We're close," Riley said, his voice steady. He had slowed his pace to match Sarah's, but the urgency was still there in his every movement. "Just a little further." The forest opened up as they crested the ridge, revealing a small clearing ahead. In the distance, Sarah could make out the faint outline of an old wooden structure, the lookout tower. It was tall and sturdy, perched on the edge of the ridge, and it seemed like their only chance. They pushed forward, climbing the final stretch to the tower, their legs heavy with exhaustion. As they neared the base of the tower, Sarah stumbled slightly, the fatigue finally catching up with her. Riley was already halfway up the wooden ladder leading to the platform above. He turned back, his eyes sharp with concern. "Come on," he urged, his voice low but urgent. "We don't have much time." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath, and began to climb. Every step felt like it took more energy than the last, her arms shaking from the effort. The ladder creaked beneath her weight as she reached the top, where Riley was waiting, watching the forest below them. The platform was small but offered a clear view of the surrounding woods. From here, Sarah could see the faint outline of the road they had been following earlier, now a distant line of dust and gravel. The forest stretched out in all directions, thick with trees, but the lights of the truck or any sign of their pursuers were nowhere to be seen. Riley crouched low, scanning the area with a quick glance. "We need to figure out where they are," he said, his voice tight. "We'll have a better chance of evading them from here." Sarah followed his gaze, looking out over the treetops. The forest seemed endless, and for a moment, she was struck by how small and vulnerable they were. They were alone, trapped in this wilderness, and there was nowhere left to hide. But then, a sound, faint but unmistakable, reached her ears. The low hum of an engine. The truck. "Riley," Sarah whispered, pointing toward the sound. "They're coming." Riley's eyes narrowed as he listened, his jaw clenching. "They're not far," he said. "We need to get to the radio at the base of the tower. We have to call for help. If we don't." But before he could finish, a flash of light appeared in the distance. A beam of headlights, cutting through the trees. Sarah's heart leaped in her chest. They had been found. The truck was getting closer. "We're running out of time," Riley muttered under his breath, his face a mask of determination. "We have to move." Sarah nodded, her hands trembling as she followed him down the ladder. They couldn't stay on the tower any longer. The truck was closing in, and soon they would be trapped again, this time with nowhere left to run. As they reached the base of the tower, Riley pulled Sarah into the trees, moving swiftly but quietly, trying to cover as much ground as possible. They were back on the path now, the sounds of the truck still distant but growing louder. Riley glanced over his shoulder. "There's a small clearing up ahead. We'll have a better chance of seeing where they are from there." They pushed forward, their steps quick but cautious. The forest seemed to close in around them again, the shadows growing deeper with every passing moment. Every snap of a twig felt like it could be their last, and Sarah's heart was pounding in her ears as they reached the edge of the clearing. Just as they stepped into the open, the engine noise grew louder, too loud. The truck was right behind them now, the headlights blinding as it rounded the corner and came into view. "Move!" Riley shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the trees once more. But it was too late. The truck skidded to a halt just a few yards away, and men poured out, guns raised and ready. The figures moved fast, closing in on them from all sides. The truck's engine roared, its headlights blinding in the darkness as the men jumped out, spreading out in a well-practiced formation. The sound of their boots hitting the ground echoed through the trees, the crunch of the gravel beneath their feet like the countdown to the end of their freedom. Riley's grip tightened around Sarah's arm as he pulled her further into the trees, his face grim with determination. They couldn't outrun them anymore, not with the men closing in from all directions. Sarah's heart raced as she glanced back, her stomach twisting with dread. The men were closing in fast, their figures emerging from the shadows, their faces masked in grim resolve. It was clear now that they were outnumbered. The truck had been just the beginning. "We're cornered," Riley muttered under his breath, his eyes darting around. "But we can't give up yet." Sarah felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. They were out of options, and the men were nearly on top of them. The forest had once felt like a refuge, but now it seemed like a trap. Suddenly, a shout rang out from behind them, followed by the sound of a gunshot, the crack of the bullet splitting the air. "Stay down," Riley shouted, his voice urgent. He yanked Sarah to the ground, pulling her close to a large rock as they hit the dirt. The gunfire echoed again, but this time it wasn't directed at them. They both looked up, startled by the sudden interruption. A blur of movement emerged from the trees to their right. It was another vehicle, its headlights cutting through the darkness, and this time the vehicle wasn't stopping for the men. The truck screeched to a halt just a few yards away from the men who were still closing in on Riley and Sarah, and the figures who emerged from it were armed, too. But they weren't the same group that had been hunting them. The new arrivals, tall and purposeful, began moving toward the men who had been chasing Riley and Sarah. One of the men in the group raised his gun, but the strangers were quicker. Gunfire erupted once more, fast and precise, and the attackers' hands were forced into the air. "What the hell?" one of the men shouted, his voice filled with anger and confusion. But before he could react, the strangers had already secured them. Riley pulled Sarah to her feet, his face tense, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "We need to go now," he whispered, grabbing her hand and tugging her toward the new arrivals. Before Sarah could say anything, one of the newcomers, a tall woman in tactical gear, came forward, her weapon lowered but still in hand. She motioned for them to follow. "You're safe now," she said, her voice steady and confident, though the situation was anything but calm. "We're with the FBI. You're not going to be hurt." Sarah blinked in disbelief, trying to process everything that had happened in the past few moments. "The FBI? But what's going on? Who are these men?" The woman's expression hardened, her eyes scanning the men they had just neutralized. "They're part of an underground operation," she said, her voice tight. "A network tied to human trafficking and drug smuggling, operating in these woods for years. Your son, Owen, was close to uncovering their activities before he and his wife were taken. That's why they've been hunting you." Sarah's mind raced as the woman's words sank in. "Owen, he wasn't just missing. He was targeted." "Yes," the woman replied, glancing back at the men who were now on the ground, cuffed and surrounded by her team. They had their hands in everything, from illegal trade to extortion. Your son was involved in a DEA investigation into them, which made him a threat. Sarah's chest tightened as she processed the realization. Owen's disappearance, Emily's involvement, the hunt for them, it was all connected to a much larger operation. "But why didn't anyone tell me?" Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. "Why did they let us keep searching all this time without knowing the truth?" The woman sighed, her expression grim. "We couldn't risk blowing the operation. The last thing we needed was for them to know we were onto them. But we've been watching the area, tracking their every move. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The lengths to which this network had gone, the extent of their corruption, was staggering. "We've been tracking the people behind this," the woman continued. "And now, thanks to you, we've gathered enough evidence to shut them down for good. But this isn't over. There's still more we need to uncover." Riley glanced at Sarah, his jaw clenched, but his eyes softened slightly. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded slowly, though her mind was still reeling. "I think so. But, Owen, we still don't know where he is." The woman stepped closer, her face more sympathetic than before. "We have a lead. One of the men we apprehended is one of their higher-ups. We're going to get more information from him, and we'll find your son. We'll make sure he's brought back safely." For the first time in what felt like forever, a spark of hope flared in Sarah's chest. It wasn't over. Not yet. Riley turned to her, his hand still on hers, offering a quiet but steady reassurance. "We're getting closer, Sarah. We won't stop until we have answers." The woman nodded, signaling to her team to secure the area. "We'll be in touch. You're not alone in this anymore." As Sarah took in the scene around her, the men they had been running from now subdued, the FBI team working swiftly to secure the area, she felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. The nightmare wasn't over, but at least it had taken a turn for the better. They had a chance now. The journey wasn't finished. But Sarah finally felt like she could see the end in sight. The cold night air still clung to the edges of Sarah's skin as she stood there, surrounded by the officers, her mind reeling from the flood of information. The world felt strangely quiet now, the harsh sounds of pursuit replaced by the low murmurs of the FBI team as they secured the area and processed the captured men. Sarah's body still trembled with the adrenaline that had carried her through the nightmare. But now, there was a flicker of something else, a cautious hope. "Let's move," the woman from the FBI said, her voice cutting through the stillness. "We've set up a safe house nearby. You'll be able to rest and get some answers there." Sarah nodded numbly, her gaze flicking between Riley and the agents around her. The tension that had clung to her for days, the endless fear, the sense of being hunted, was slowly starting to ebb away. The weight of the past 2 years was still with her, but for the first time, it felt like she could breathe again. Riley gave her a quiet nod, his hand gently brushing hers as they followed the agents toward the SUV waiting nearby. "We're almost there," he murmured, his voice low but reassuring. The drive was a blur. The city lights flickered in the distance, but Sarah couldn't focus on them. Her thoughts kept returning to Owen. What had he been through? And Emily? Was she still alive? The questions pounded in her head, relentless and painful. When they arrived at the safe house, the first thing Sarah did was sit down. Her body was aching, and her mind was exhausted. Riley sat beside her, his presence steadying, grounding her in the midst of everything. The quiet of the safe house was a welcome change from the chaos they had just escaped, but it still felt surreal. The FBI agents gave them time to rest, offering food and water, and for a while, Sarah simply stared at the walls, trying to process everything. After what felt like an eternity, the woman from the FBI, who had introduced herself as Agent Taylor, returned. "We've got information," Agent Taylor said, sitting down across from Sarah and Riley. She seemed both professional and sympathetic, her face lined with exhaustion, but her eyes were determined. "The man we captured, he's one of the top operatives in the network. We've been able to extract some information from him." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What did he say? Where is Owen?" Agent Taylor's expression softened. "It's not good news, but we've been able to track down one of their safe houses. It's isolated, deep in the woods. We believe that's where they've been keeping your son." Sarah's hands shook, and she struggled to keep her voice steady. "How long has he been there? Is he alive?" "We don't know for certain, but we're doing everything we can to find him," Agent Taylor said. "We're assembling a team to go in. It's risky, but it's our best chance to get him out." "Then we're going with you," Riley said before Sarah could respond. His voice was firm, resolute. "We're not sitting here while you go after him. We'll help." Agent Taylor hesitated, her eyes flicking to Sarah. She clearly wanted to object, but she knew that Riley was right. The need to find Owen had become personal, and Sarah wasn't going to sit by while others did the work she felt so deeply responsible for. "We'll need you to stay out of the way once we get to the site," Agent Taylor said, her voice now calm and controlled. "But yes, if you want to come, we'll take you." Sarah could see the hesitation in Riley's face, but he didn't argue. They both knew they had no other option. They couldn't wait any longer. It didn't take long to prepare. The FBI team had their gear ready, and soon Sarah and Riley were in the back of an SUV, driving through the dark streets toward the safe house that held the answers they had been searching for. The journey felt too quiet, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to hit. As they neared the location, Sarah's nerves were on edge, her fingers gripping the seat beneath her. Riley sat beside her, his jaw clenched, his eyes hard with determination. She could feel the tension in him, too. This was it. The moment they had been running toward for so long. The final chance to find Owen, to bring him home. When they arrived at the site, the landscape was eerie. A small compound, hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by fences and thick trees. The lights inside the buildings were dim, but Sarah could sense the presence of people inside. This was it, the place that had been hiding her son. Agent Taylor signaled for the team to move out, and Sarah and Riley followed closely behind, the weight of everything pressing down on them. This was the moment they had been fighting for. The next few hours would decide everything. "Stay close," Agent Taylor ordered, her voice steady and firm as they approached the entrance. They moved quickly, their footsteps silent on the ground. The compound was well guarded, but the FBI team was ready. They had been planning this raid for weeks, and everything had led to this point. When they reached the entrance, Agent Taylor signaled the team to prepare. With a swift motion, the door was forced open, and they flooded inside. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest as she scanned the dark interior, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The building was small but filled with the unmistakable feeling of captivity. There were no windows, just concrete walls and narrow hallways. The air was thick, suffocating. They moved deeper into the building, each room they passed making Sarah's stomach twist with dread. But then, at the end of the hall, she heard something. A faint sound, the scraping of chains. "Owen," she whispered under her breath, her voice trembling with fear and hope. Riley's hand squeezed hers as they reached the door at the end of the hallway. Agent Taylor held up her hand, signaling for everyone to be quiet. They opened the door slowly, and there, in the far corner of the room, lying on a makeshift bed, was Owen. He looked different, emaciated, his face gaunt, his clothes torn and stained, but he was alive. "Owen!" Sarah gasped, stepping forward. His head turned weakly, and for the first time in 2 years, their eyes met. "Owen," she whispered again, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We found you." Riley stepped back, giving them a moment, but Sarah couldn't take her eyes off her son. He was alive. He had made it. Against all odds, he was here. The nightmare was finally over.